If you want to reach the 1000 elo rating in chess, what you have to do is start to go through some theory, both openings and endgames. Today I'm going to show you a particular ending, the basics of the king versus lone pawn and king endgame. The first thing you have to understand is that if you have your king, this one, in this case, let's say it's the black king, in front of the enemy pawn, it's a draw. It's just a draw, by theory. If you do the right moves and follow the right path, it doesn't matter what the opponent will do, it will end in a draw. In this position, for example, it's white to move first. King goes on e2, and if you answer to this move with king on c3, you basically dug your own grave. Because now white's king marches forward, and you cannot go here because of the pawn, nor here because of the king, nor here either. So the only thing is either this or this. But as the engine says, it's going, you're lost. You just cannot win this. Because now the king marches forward, you have to move yet again, then he pushes his pawn, and it's the same until you get at the end. See, you have to go back again, and now the pawn, doesn't matter, whatever you do, will just march forward. It doesn't even need the king. And now you're going to lose. Of course, if your opponent knows how to check with a queen and a king. If you don't know how to do that either, you should watch my video regarding the queen and king versus king endgame. There's also rook and king endgame. You should consider watching that. I'll just leave the link into the description if you need it. By the way, as we were saying, the other choice of the black king is to go here. But then the white king will oppose to you again. And you cannot reach that pawn in any way. This is just another blunder. Yet again, you're not even trying if you do this. What instead you have to do is to slide back in the center. And now it's a draw, 100%. Because if the king tries to get through and go on e3, you just oppose to him. And he can do two things. Slide back his king, and that doesn't accomplish anything. Or check you. When he checks you, you go again in front of the pawn. So what you have to know, listen carefully and do every time this. You'll always end in a draw. You'll not lose the match. When you can step in front of the opponent's pawn, you should do so. That's what you have to do. All that you have to do is not that hard. By theory, when the king has to step away from the pawn, you always go straight back. Because then king on e4 follows, you oppose yet again, check, and you go on d6 in front of the opponent's pawn. The same procedure will follow over and over again until eventually you get at the end of the board. Here, king e6, you oppose, check as before, and king d8. Now, the white king has two choices: to step away from the pawn. So for example, if king f7, you take the pawn and it's over. You didn't struggle, you followed the rules, the theory, and got away with half a point. If the king decides to stay near his pawn, if the king wants to remain near his pawn, the only thing he can do is go on d6, and it's stalemate. So by theory, every time this happens, you'll end up in a draw. Of course, if you are in front of the pawn. Otherwise, things will turn out differently. It depends on the situation. So let's get to the basics of the opposition. Whoever moves first has not the opposition. Opposition means you oppose, as the word says, of course, the other king, and he cannot get through. Of course, here it's a draw because there are just two kings. It's just to show you the concept. So if white, for example, has to move, as before, he goes on e3 and you oppose. he goes on f3 and you oppose it yet again. g3, you oppose. They go back, you oppose. What if king e3? Exactly, you oppose. If he goes back, you go forward and take space. He goes on d2, you oppose. He goes on c1, you go on c3. So there is no way that king will get through. An advice I would give to you is when an endgame is reached in general, you should rush as soon as possible and as fast as possible to the center with your king. That's the right way to take an advantage over your opponent. Then of course it depends, but in general this is the rule. Now, what happens when the opponent's king is in front of your pawn and the pawn is a rook pawn? That means a pawn on the h file or a file. So in every case, this is a draw. Whoever has to move first. For example, if black has to move first, where do you go? Exactly, back. Now white's king can go on g2 and he takes space. So you cannot go back here nor on g3. What you do? You oppose the king. This is always a draw since there is only one side. If the king goes on the other side of the board, it will fall over the edges of the board. It cannot be done. Pawn marches forward. Where are you going this time? Again, in front of the pawn. King slides back. King h2. You go back. And this path will be repeated over and over and over again until you reach this point. King slides back once again. King g6, king g8, pawn h7 check, and the race is over if king on h8. Because then when king goes back on h8, it's both as before. The king has to go away and you take the pawn, or h6 and it's a draw. In this position, if black is to move, he just opposes, as we said before, and the game will eventually end in a draw. But if it's white to move, it becomes quite different. Because now white can push his pawn. The king cannot go here, here, and here. So the only option that remains is king on h7. Now king f7 follows. King h6, you queen. King h5. And here there is something fancy that is a mate in 2 with queen on g3. Now the black king has to go back and queen g6 is checkmate. Last but not least, this is a distant opposition. That is the same reasoning as before, but the kings are far from each other. In this position, you have to count how many squares separates the two kings. In this case, 6 squares. Now the rule is, whoever moves when the number of squares is odd doesn't have the opposition. Let's see, if white moves on e2, now there are 5 squares between the two kings. So when king e7, king e3, now there are 3 squares. King e6, now there are 2 squares. And king e4, white has the opposition because he doesn't move for first. King f6, king f4. King e6, king e4 follows. King d6, king d4. The same exact thing happen when they are on the diagonals. Here there are 6 squares, but now the black king has to move first. So the black king will have the opposition, because there is an even number of squares. Let's see, king g7, king b2, king f6, king c3, 2 squares, king e5, and now it's up to white. And if he goes on c4, you oppose with e4. If it goes on d3, you oppose on d5. So king c3, king c5, d3 again, d5, and so on. To sum up, when the opponent's king is in front of your pawn, it will be a draw by theory. When you oppose your opponent's pawn, the best move for the king is to go straight back. When the endgame happens, rush your king in the center as fast as possible. Rook pawns and king versus king will always be a draw, unless, of course, if the opponent's king is having some business on the other side of the board. And in the distant opposition, whoever moves first when there is an odd number of squares will not have the opposition. For today, I think it's enough. I don't want to overwhelm you with informations, otherwise you'll also get confused. I hope you have enjoyed the video. If you want to support me, subscribe and hit the like button. I leave the link into the description for whoever doesn't have a clue how to checkmate with a rook and a king versus king and a queen and a king versus king. That sounds like a tongue twister, but it's not. What else? I hope you'll have a great day. See ya.